All right, ready to dive into some seriously fascinating philosophy today. We're going deep, deep into the mind of Baruch Spinoza,
Ah,
the
Spinoza.
17th century thinker, but his ideas about human psychology still so relevant today,
Yeah.
especially for, well, anyone who loves a good philosophy deep dive.
What's really remarkable about Spinoza is, well, he approached human psychology from a completely different perspective. Didn't see humans as, separate from nature, or above it.
Right.
He argued that we're governed by, well, the same universal laws as everything else.
And that's what makes him so fascinating. We're basing this deep dive on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Spinoza's psychological theory.
Oh, a classic.
So get ready for some dense, but trust me, truly rewarding exploration. To kick things off, maybe you could tell us a bit about this idea of humans being a part of nature.
Sure.
I mean, what does it even mean? And why was it so radical back then?
Well, you see, back in Spinoza's day, the main way people saw the world, they put humans at the center of everything, like separate from nature and superior to the natural world, of course.
Yeah.
But Spinoza, he kind of flips this whole idea on its head. He argues that we're not exceptions to the laws of nature, but we're actually expressions of them. So everything that makes us human, our bodies, our thoughts, our emotions, all of it can be understood by looking at these natural laws.
So that's where his famous concept of Conatus comes in, right?
Exactly.
The striving to persevere in being.
It's a fundamental concept for him.
But what's so groundbreaking about applying this concept to, well, everything, not just as humans?
Yeah. Conatus is, often oversimplified. People think it's just inertia, but it's way more dynamic than that. Spinoza sees it as this, active force, this striving to not just exist, but to, really enhance our existence, become more powerful, more capable in the world. And the truly radical part, he applies this to absolutely everything, not just humans. I mean, plants, rocks, animals, everything has this built-in drive to persevere and flourish.
Okay, I'll be honest. I'm a little skeptical. I mean, how can a principle, one usually used to describe physical objects, explain something as complex as the human mind?
Right. It does seem a bit counterintuitive, doesn't it? Applying, something like inertia to something as dynamic and complex as the human mind. But that's where Spinoza's genius really shines.
Okay.
He argues that our minds, all our thoughts, all our emotions, they're all expressions of this underlying striving, this conatus.
So it's not just that our bodies are striving, but our minds are too.
Exactly. They're not separate from our physical being, but they emerge from it, you see.
So he's basically suggesting that our mental and emotional lives are deeply intertwined with our physical existence. And it's all driven by this fundamental striving to what? Persist and thrive.
You got it.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah. And it leads us to, well, one of the most fascinating and maybe even challenging aspects of Spinoza's philosophy, his view on emotions, or what he calls affects.
Okay, let's unpack that. How does Spinoza connect Conatus to human emotions? Because that feels like a jump.
Well, he starts by saying that desire is essentially striving, but combined with consciousness. So to put it simply, we desire what we see as beneficial to our striving, to our continued existence and our flourishing. And from this basic desire, he says all other emotions spring up.
So our emotions aren't just these random feelings, but are deeply tied to this drive to, well, survive and become more powerful.
Exactly.
But how do we explain all the different emotions we experience? I mean, love, hate, joy, sadness, anger, they all feel so unique.
Yeah.
How can they all come from the same place?
Well, that's where Spinoza brings in his idea of joy and sadness. He sees these two as the most basic effects, the building blocks, you could say, for all the other emotions. Joy, for Spinoza, it's an increase in our power to act, to strive. It's a feeling of expansion, like becoming more capable.
I like that, becoming more capable.
And then sadness, well, that's the opposite. It's a decrease in that power, a feeling of contraction or being held back.
So every other emotion, no matter how complex, it all goes back to these two basic effects, these shifts in our power.
That's exactly it. Think of it like a spectrum. Love, for example, it's a form of joy, right? Because it connects us to something that enhances our power to act and flourish. But hate, on the other hand, that's rooted in sadness. It comes from feeling threatened, like our well-being is in danger. All the nuances, all the complexities of human emotions are just variations on these fundamental themes, you see.
This is a really interesting way to think about emotions. It's like even the emotions we usually see as negative, they actually have a purpose,
Right.
a function in our striving for self-preservation.
Exactly. Spinoza really challenges that traditional way of looking at emotions, where we see them as something to be controlled or suppressed. He sees them as valuable signals, feedback mechanisms. They tell us if something is beneficial or harmful to our striving.
So instead of judging our emotions, as good or bad, we should try to understand what they're telling us about
Yes.
our relationship with the world and our own striving.
Exactly. It's about developing a deeper awareness of our own emotions, recognizing the underlying causes and motivations behind them. That, for Spinoza, is the key to more freedom and a more fulfilling life.
This idea of understanding our emotions, like they're rooted in Conatus, it's really making me think differently about my own feelings. But I'm curious about how this works with specific emotions. Like, what about pity?
Pity.
How does Spinoza, with all his emphasis on power and self-preservation, approach something that seems so selfless?
That's where his analysis gets really interesting. And while for some a bit controversial, he actually says that pity decreases our power, sees it as a type of sadness.
Oh, it comes from us, being aware of someone else's suffering. And since sadness, like we talked about, it's a decrease in our power to act and strive, pity, well, it weakens us.
That's not how we usually think of pity. It's seen as virtue, a sign of empathy. Is Spinoza saying we shouldn't have compassion at all?
Not exactly.
Yeah.
But he is asking us to think more critically about pity,
Right.
its role in our lives, our ethical actions. He argues that when pity takes over, we get so focused on the other person's suffering that it can paralyze us. It can stop us from actually doing something to help, to ease their pain, or even our own.
So he's not saying we shouldn't care about other people's suffering, but we shouldn't let it overwhelm us to the point where it becomes, well, debilitating.
Exactly. Spinoza believes true compassion means understanding and action. Instead of just like wallowing in pity, he'd say we should put our energy into actions that increase our power. And hopefully the power of others too. Genuine empowerment, that's the key to a virtuous life for him. This makes me think about self-esteem. Where does that fit into Spinoza's view of emotions?
Self-esteem, for Spinoza, it's a powerful affect, a type of joy, actually. He calls it acquiescentia in si ipso, which basically means self-contentment or being at peace with yourself. It comes from understanding that we are the cause of our own actions, recognizing our own agency and ability to shape our lives.
So it's not about like ego or arrogance. It's about recognizing our power to actually do things in the world.
Precisely. Spinoza thought this recognition of our power, it was essential for achieving what he called blessedness, which is like the highest form of happiness for humans. Blessedness isn't about, fleeting pleasures, but a deeper, more lasting joy, the kind that comes from understanding ourselves and our place in the universe.
That idea, self-esteem as a path to happiness, it actually lines up with a lot of modern psychology, right? But it also seems to connect back to Spinoza's focus on reason and self-knowledge.
Oh, absolutely. He saw cultivating reason as the key to understanding our emotions, mastering them, not being controlled by them. He believed that through reason, we could see our desires, our fears, and our motivations more clearly. And then, well, we could make choices that really align with our striving for self-preservation, for flourishing.
Okay, we've talked about pity and self-esteem. What about some other classic emotions like fear and wonder? How do those fit in?
Spinoza had some really sharp observations about fear and wonder, especially when it came to understanding society and politics. He knew how powerful fear could be in controlling people. He even suggested that states could use threats to make sure their citizens obeyed.
That sounds, well, a bit manipulative, doesn't it? Using fear to, like, control people.
It does, and in his later writings on politics, Spinoza explores other ways. In his theological political treatise, he argues that appealing to wonder and devotion, it can actually be more effective and ethical for governing. He uses the example of Moses, who brought religion into the Hebrew state, not just as rules backed up by fear, but as something inspiring, something to be in awe of.
So instead of ruling through fear and punishment, he saw value in inspiring people and fostering this sense of shared purpose and wonder. That seems very different from how things were usually done back then.
It was, and, well, it still is. Spinoza's ideas about how emotions work in politics are really relevant even today, as we deal with things like social cohesion, political divides, and the ethics of leadership. He reminds us that emotions are powerful. They can be used for good or bad, and that cultivating positive emotions like joy, wonder, and a sense of belonging, that's crucial for building a just and flourishing society.
That makes me think of another important distinction Spinoza makes, right? The difference between passive and active effects.
Oh, you're right. That's a key part of understanding how Spinoza sees us moving from being controlled by outside forces to becoming more self-determined, more empowered. Remember, for him, it all comes back to striving, to Conatus.
Yeah.
Passive effects, they come from outside causes, things that just happen to us that we don't have much control over.
So passive effects are like reactions to the world around us,
Yeah.
like being startled by a loud noise or feeling sad when someone we love leaves.
Exactly. They're basically emotional responses that take away from our power to act. Active effects, on the other hand, they come from inside us. They come from our understanding, from our ability to act intentionally in the world based on reason and knowledge.
That sounds similar to what we were saying about self-esteem, right?
Yeah.
Recognizing ourselves as the cause of our actions, not just reacting to external things.
Very much related. Active joy, for example, it's not just feeling pleasure, but understanding where that pleasure comes from and recognizing our role in creating it. And active desire, it's not about being pulled around by external temptations, but setting our own goals, choosing our path based on what we understand is truly beneficial to our striving.
So active effects are about becoming more conscious, more intentional in how we act and respond emotionally.
Precisely. They represent a shift from being passively controlled by outside sources to becoming active agents in our own lives and shaping our own destiny. This is where Spinoza's ethics really start to take shape.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. How does this idea of passive and active effects connect to what Spinoza thought about good and evil and how we should live?
This brings us to one of the most important active effects in his whole ethical framework, nobility, or what he calls generositas.
Nobility, generosity. Okay, tell me more. How does that connect to living a good life?
Nobility, for Spinoza, it's a completely active desire. It's the desire to connect with others in friendship, to help them, to contribute to their well-being. It comes from our understanding that our own flourishing is tied to the flourishing of others. It's a powerful counter to the idea that Spinoza's ethics are all about just looking out for yourself.
So even though at some level all actions are driven by Conatus, by this drive to preserve ourselves, Spinoza sees a way for real altruism through this active affect of nobility. It challenges that idea that he's just a, strict psychological egoist.
It does, and this is where Spinoza's philosophy gets so complex and nuanced. He argues that when we truly understand our own striving, we realize that helping others, contributing to their flourishing, it ultimately benefits our own striving too. It's this amazing insight, connecting our own individual flourishing with the well-being of everyone.
This is beautiful, but I have to admit, I'm still trying to square it with his earlier ideas about psychological egoism, where he seemed to say that all actions are ultimately self-interested.
You've hit on one of the most challenging, most debated parts of Spinoza's whole philosophy. It's the question that still fascinates and perplexes scholars even today. How can we reconcile this idea that all actions are driven by Conatus with the possibility of true altruism and ethical behavior that goes beyond self-interest? To really answer that, we need to go deeper into his ideas about good and evil, to see how he navigates this apparent contradiction.
This is getting really deep. I'm eager to hear how he resolves this tension between self-preservation and ethical action. Let's dive into good and evil and see where it takes us. Okay, so we've been on this incredible journey through Spinoza's ideas, Conatus, emotions, and this whole idea that we're fundamentally part of nature. But now, let's tackle maybe the biggest philosophical question there is, good and evil. How does Spinoza define these concepts, especially with all his focus on self-preservation and this drive to persevere?
Well, this is where Spinoza really throws a wrench in the works, challenges traditional ideas about morality. He says good and evil aren't like objective qualities, things that are just inherently good or evil. He calls them modes of thinking, which means they're labels we put on things based on, you guessed it, our own desires and striving. So what's good for one person might be evil for someone else, and something else might not even matter to another person. It's all relative.
So he's saying good and evil aren't absolute. It all comes down to the individual's perspective on what they want. Yeah, I could see how that would ruffle some feathers.
It definitely pushes back against those traditional moral frameworks, the ones that rely on these fixed ideas of right and wrong. So Spinoza says we don't desire something because it's good. We call it good because we desire it. So our ideas of good and evil, they come from our own nature, from that drive for self-preservation and flourishing. What we see as good is just what we think will help us keep going, help us thrive.
Okay, so I think I'm starting to get it. So like someone who really values wealth and power, they would see those things as good. But someone else who prioritizes knowledge and understanding, they might see those as the ultimate good.
Exactly. Spinoza says each thing as far as it can by its own power, strives to persevere in its being. A greedy person, well, they'd say having lots of money is the best thing and being poor is the worst. An ambitious person, they want nothing more than respect and they fear nothing more than shame. These judgments, they come from their own individual nature and what they think will help them in their own striving.
This makes sense, but it brings up a big question. If good and evil are so subjective, just based on what we personally desire, doesn't that make Spinoza's whole ethical system kind of self-centered? Is there no room for thinking about others, for altruism, in his view?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's one Spinoza tackles head on. He ties the idea of good to what benefits us individually, sure. But he also brings in another important concept to help bridge this gap, and that's perfection. This is where things get even more interesting.
Okay, tell me more about Spinozan perfection. How does that connect to his ideas about good and evil?
For Spinoza, perfection isn't about some external standard of goodness, some perfect ideal. It's about reaching our full potential to act and exist. It's about understanding and realizing our capabilities as human beings, living in accordance with our nature.
So it's not about fitting in to some external moral code,
Yeah.
but about becoming the best version of ourselves, like the fullest expression of our striving.
Exactly. And here's the key connection. Joy, remember, that's an increase in our power to strive. It's also a movement toward greater perfection. So when we experience joy, we're realizing our potential, becoming more fully ourselves.
I see. So what's good for us, what makes us happy and helps us thrive is also what makes us more perfect. It's about aligning our own personal desires with our striving for greater understanding and fulfillment.
You got it. And remember, for Spinoza, we're not isolated individuals. We're part of nature, connected to everything. So our own individual perfection is linked to the perfection of the whole.
And that's where that idea of nobility comes back in,
Yeah.
right? The desire to connect with others, to contribute to their well-being. That's also part of our striving for perfection.
Exactly. Spinoza says when we really get our own striving, we see that helping others, contributing to their flourishing, it ultimately benefits us too. It's this interconnectedness, this understanding of ourselves as part of something bigger that makes true altruism possible, even within Spinoza's framework that might seem egoistic at first.
That's a pretty profound idea. It means true self-interest, at least as Spinoza sees it, isn't about being selfish. It's about aligning our own striving with the well-being of others and the perfection of everything. It's a beautiful vision, but also a challenging one. It asks us to really look at our motivations, to develop our reason, and to keep striving for a deeper understanding of ourselves and our place in the world.
And that's a perfect place to wrap up, I think. Spinoza reminds us that pursuing knowledge, that constant effort to understand ourselves and the world around us, that's the path to both individual and collective flourishing.
I couldn't agree more. Thanks so much for this amazing deep dive into Spinoza's thought. It's really made me think about human psychology, emotions, and good and evil in a whole new way.
It's been my pleasure. And to everyone listening, keep asking questions, keep striving, and keep exploring this incredible, endlessly fascinating world of philosophy.